Good morning. We are so thrilled that you've decided to join us again as we continue our conversations on the book of John. We're going to look at probably one of my favorite chapters in the first half of the book, the one that is aptly entitled The Book of Signs. It's John chapter 4, and it is going to be a journey that leads us from Judea to Samaria, so stay tuned. Before we enter and engage in our conversations, though, you're going to notice we're in our new studio, so thank you for those of you who have been asking, when are you moving back into the studio? Where we are back now, and we have one of my best buds, one of my co-hosts, one of my friends, partner in ministry that is going to join me for a conversation. And as our conversations are always, it's going to be full of deep thinking. Before we enter and engage into all of that, we also want to thank all of you who have partnered with us and continue to bless us with your thoughtful giving. If you want to be part of this ministry, or if you find what we are producing to be meaningful to your life, it's very easy. You simply go on LLUC.org, tab Give, highlight one of those ministries that will appear. It's a Sabbath School ministry, and every single dime that you place there is used to produce content such as this. So again, thank you for those thoughtful gifts. And now we're going to just start with our conversation as we bow and pray. God, thank you so much for your blessings, your love, your care. We just ask that you continue to move through us. And as you move through us, Lord, that those whom we encounter might be able to see you. For we pray these things in your name. Amen. So I am thrilled to introduce in our brand new studio my good friend, Chris Stanley. Chris, as many of you know, is our resident Australian because every team has to have an Australian. And he is also our pastor for high school ministries and a thoughtful theologian. Chris, how are you today?
I'm doing well. I'm glad to hang out and have this conversation with you. I appreciate you immensely as well. And it's always exciting just to explore the scripture together. So thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for being here. I love just sharing and having time together to chat. I find that we are particularly good conversation partners, and I always learn something when we engage in it. So I'm thrilled. Chris, I think I learned this week something about you, and that is I always learn something about you. And that is that your daughter is, by the way, your whole family is brilliant.
Oh, you're kind.
Your wife is a PhD candidate in neurobiology.
Yeah, neuroscience, neuropsychopharmacology.
Neuropsychopharmacology.
Drugs and brains.
Drugs and brains, which are two things that we love. And she's brilliant, by the way. And so, and I don't know where your daughter, your eldest, gets her thoughtful brilliance from, because you're very thoughtful and introspective.
You're kind. But it's my wife as well, and mostly. No, yeah, my daughter is an incredible kid. So is my son as well. There's just a universe inside of them. They're complex, deep thinkers who, the thing I love many things about my kids, but in our house, we have an upper reading limit per day of time that they can, we don't have a minimum because they will cover that easily, but we've got an upper limit because the two of them will just be lost in books for hours, and it's just the sweetest thing. So,
well, Chris, they're incredible. I learned that it was your kids that were dragging you to to a training session on evangelism of all things, and you were like, "Oh, do we have to go?" I find myself that a really good use for my Sabbath afternoons is napping.
Yep.
But it's good to have kids that are pushing us.
Listen, it was well entertaining because I was interested in the topic as it was first presented. Sharing the gospel with the worldly and the wealthy and the well-educated. I thought that was a very important area. So we signed up for the first one and just to see the presentation. The presentation was excellent. It was clear. It was thoughtful. And at the end, I just turned to my daughter, who was just enraptured with the presentation. I was like, "Oh, hey, honey, what do you think of that?" She's like, "That was the most amazing thing I've ever seen." I was like, "Do you want to come back?" She's like, "We've got to go through every single one of these." And it was just incredible. She's only 9, and the presentation wasn't prepared for 9-year-olds, but it was given in such a way that was so clear and succinct and simple and yet profound that it was completely engaging for my daughter. And she sat through all of the presentations, all 5 of them, and understood them deeply and properly. And it was incredible the follow-up conversations we'd have with her in terms of the content that she easily accessed and really found intellectually stimulating. So yeah, it's kind of cool. So yeah,
that's Loma Linda for you all folks. We've got 9-year-olds attending adult classes, and she's brilliant. She truly is. She truly is. I've just so enjoyed having the Stanleys in our community. It's been what, 4 or 5 years already?
Coming up to 5 years.
Yeah. So it's been a while that you've been. It doesn't feel.
It goes quick.
It's incredible because I feel you guys just moved from Redlands.
Yep.
And that was 5 years ago.
Yeah. Yep. Honestly.
Good grief.
Honestly, it flew through, and it has its. This community is an incredible place to be. Amongst other things, it is intellectually stimulating. It is a place where you can come and think deeply and carefully about your faith. It is a place where that is encouraged, and it is a place where that is supported. And I think that's an incredible thing to be a part of. So it's been wonderful. Yeah.
Well, you've been
I shouldn't say being, like it sounds like past.
Yeah, you're not going anywhere. We're not having you leave anytime soon.
No, but it is.
Well, great. I'm so happy that you're finding that. That's, I think, what we try to create, and that's kind of the ethos of Loma Linda. So often, universities ought to be the place where you come to have these questions, whether they be questions about faith or whether they be questions about, in this particular institution, science and healthcare. But they're supposed to be places that encourage thinking, and it's so amazing that our faith community, has modeled that for both the university and the medical center.
Yeah, honestly, this is the time in your life theoretically as you come through college and into your postgraduate positions that people are pursuing here as well, where you should have the courage and the encouragement to think carefully and critically. And truth needs no defenders if it is not true. If it is able to stand under close scrutiny and questioning, it will show itself to be absolutely true. And so this is an institution that is dedicated to the freedom and the pursuit of knowledge that will stand and be tested and be shown to be true. And so I think an encouragement in a questioning, critical, careful mindset that this place demonstrates and lives out. I love it. I respect it, and I love it.
And that's Adventism, really.
Honestly, that's what it's meant to be. Yep.
Yeah. This idea that to be an Adventist is to be part of a long tradition that is constantly examined and has examined these truth claims that we make, to weigh them and see if they're still the best ways and the best tools that we have to talk about God in a way that is relevant, both contextually, spiritually, academically, and scientifically as well, which I think Loma Linda really models well.
And then also to have that kind of unique courage to follow these things that we believe to be true. Again, you look at the early Adventist history. They were particular in their, insistence. They're like, listen, we have found the Sabbath and we believe it to be very important. and it was something that they, in a way that demonstrated incredible conviction. They said, listen, we're going to follow this because we believe this to be incredibly true. And so that sort of spirit that pursues these things, but then acts on them and says, listen, even if not a popular or a conventional view, we think we have something incredible here. So let us follow that and pursue that and see what that means.
That's a perfect segue, I think, into what John is doing throughout his gospel. As we've talked before, for those of you who view us, John's primary question is, will you believe? But it's not just intellectual assent to a set of facts about who Jesus is or what Jesus is proclaiming. It's also the realization that belief has to lead you to the pursuit of a particular life, to some life practices that are both informed and shaped by this belief. And so it's that combination between the intellectual pursuit that seeks to ask the difficult questions, and then the application of the realities that those questions lead you to live. That makes, I think, John such a powerful gospel for shaping both faith and belief.
Absolutely. And as you go through the book of John, you see John contrasting two groups of people, believers and unbelievers. And the application is, again, as you mentioned, across the board between not only intellectual assent, but the life that it leads you to live. And he contrasts these characters going back and forward. And he has this really holistic perspective of what your belief should create in a life well lived, if you've found it in these things that you give your life assent to.
So the lesson talks this week about John chapter 4. Like I said at the introduction, Chris, one of my favorite stories in Scripture.
It's incredible. It is incredible.
We were talking earlier this week, about kind of how Jesus seeks to democratize education, and how through Jesus's ministry, talking a little bit about this place and what Loma Linda stands for, it seems like throughout Jesus's earthly ministry, there is this intentional approach to democratize access to education. How people that typically would have not been invited to stay in a posture of education or of learning are invited to that place by Jesus, and by this way flying in the face of all of these constructs, these social constructs that sought to limit access to education for groups of people.
Absolutely. The more people you have participating in education, the more people you have even participating in democracy, the better the results. You create a system which incorporates information or data from more points. You end up with better information being collected, and you end up with better results. It's the example. It's kind of interesting. It comes from a little while ago. In the communistic regime of Russia, USSR, they would find themselves struggling to produce the correct amounts of bread. And the problem really seemed to be the information that was flowing through one individual who was trying to make these decisions on the production of bread. So you would have an individual trying to ascertain how much wheat needed to be produced, and that would flow through to an individual trying to work out how much the factories needed to produce. And you'd have kind of one person making that decision. And so you had this, very limited place where the data was being processed. And I remember growing up, and you'd see these huge lines outside some of those facilities for bread. And I just remember, looking at those pictures in the National Geographic, being like, that's a fascinating thing. And just trying to wrap my head around it. But then in Australia, you walk down to your local bakery and, you just buy a piece of bread. And the amount of bread that was produced in Australia was almost exactly what you needed. And the thing that was happening there is that the information about how much bread we need to create was being distributed amongst the entire population. So you had your small local sellers saying, listen, we need to order this much wheat. You had your production, you had your farmers all processing information and collecting it and democratizing this information. And the greater the number of people participating in that system, the more accurate it was for creating the well-being of all people. And bread was not overproduced or underproduced. It was pretty accurately produced. This is a very, very long example. I apologize for this, but what it is simply to say is that in a democratic system, the more people who are participating, the better and the more accurate it will be. And this isn't commentary on, communism and socialism versus, capitalism. You can create highly cooperative systems of government if you have lots of people participating in it, if you have education and democracy flourishing with everyone bringing their data and information to it. The vision of Jesus, where he begins opening up education and faith and society for everyone to participate in, it creates a better society, a better religion, a better faith for all, which I think is an incredible thing.
And that's what you find, I think, here. It's a really interesting viewpoint that you take when you see it as Jesus as a commentary, not just on the superficial question of either word of worship or the tensions that are, I think, all well known between the Jews and the Samaritans.
Yeah,
I think it's a deeper question when you ask and you see it from the perspective of what does it mean for Jesus to invite people who up until that point had been left at the margins. And now you see Jesus inviting them to become participants, active participants in the creation of a system. And in the ancient Near East, religion, faith, education, and politics are all kind of merged into one. There aren't these separations that we see now. And it seems like Jesus is inviting these people who up until that point had no voice to become part of the process.
Yes, absolutely. And radical in obviously his inclusion. But when you do that, as I was suggesting with that long, complicated illustration, it works better for everyone.
Right.
Like it creates far better outcomes, because if you don't do that, you find systems that are simply designed to protect the interests and the voice and the participation of those who have representation and those who do not suffer under those systems.
Yeah.
Democracy at its worst can be a mask for power. And if people don't participate in it equally and collectively, if we were to take a vote on staff, should we allow cats to live in America, and 3 people are allowed to vote and the rest don't bother or participate? And the answer is no. Like, you can call that a democratic system, but it's a mask of powers, and it hasn't truly represented the will of everyone collectively, which is a dangerous thing and not technically truly democracy.
It is a dangerous thing. And I think often one of the things that we struggle with is that we look at systems, whether systems of governance or economic systems or whatever other systems, we look at these constructs as ethical. So, for example, we see socialism versus capitalism, and we say one is ethical, one is not ethical. Yeah. And I think systems by themselves are constructs. They're devoid of any ethical weight. They're neither good nor bad. They're as good or bad as the people running them. And so one of the things I think that is important to recognize is even if the system itself isn't malicious, it does suffer from this myopic approach, because the people that have, like in your example with bread, I think it would have benefited the communist USSR to have people that were well fed. I also think that because there's one person who's probably been doing this job for a long period of time, who was taught to do this job by another person who had been doing this job for a long period of time. The inability to think outside of the box and to innovate is always curtailed by kind of this myopic understanding. We've always done things this way. And I think another thing that opening participation does is it allows you to innovate. And that's, I think, what's going on in the Gospel of John. The more Jesus opens space for participation, the more innovation occurs in the understanding of what could the gospel be.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. No, that's really good.
No, well, think about. So, thank you. think about the what's going on in our passage for today. So you have John chapter 3. John chapter 3 is this commentary, I think, on what myopic elitism does to a religious system. So you have Nicodemus, who comes to Jesus, I think, with really good intentions. I mean, he chooses to come to Jesus in the middle of the night and asks him some questions. He starts, I think, by doing what so many people in elitist systems do, which is, let me tell you what we know works. And so he says, we know that you are from God, because nobody could do nobody could perform the signs that you are performing if you weren't from God. And so Jesus follows down this conversation to, I think, show how this entrenched view of who God is, that is held by the spiritual elite, keeps them in darkness, as it were. He says, hey, you've got to be born again through water and the Spirit. And Nicodemus doesn't get it, and he is unable to see beyond kind of the parameters that have been laid out by him. And in John chapter 4, and John does a masterful job, I think, of comparing these two characters. In John chapter 4, you'll have somebody that's outside of the system and is able to very quickly innovate on understandings of who the Messiah should be.
In terms of her ability to, one, comprehend and then also be willing to go out and take this message immediately as a witness. It's rapid and it is quick, and it certainly is perfectly contrasted between, this preconceived position which Nicodemus is in and her openness to this. And it's interesting, you find the character of Nicodemus circling back later on in the book of John, where eventually he comes back and asks for the body of Christ, which is an incredibly brave thing to do at the end of the gospel. So you see this incredibly long arc that it takes for him to make that approach to Christ, but it is contrasted to this individual who, is shown Nicodemus in chapter 3 is kind of shown, he leaves as an unbeliever. He leaves without this, statement of assent but then, the arc slowly makes its way back to where he is shown as a believer. But John chapter 4, she's on board quickly.
Yeah. And she's on board quick. So it's so interesting, because I think I've heard, Chris, I don't know how many sermons I've heard about the woman. And most of these sermons say something like this. Well, the woman, and I think it speaks to our myopic views on women. Well, this woman was a woman of ill repute, and so she comes to the well in the middle of the day because she's embarrassed, and there she's going to find Jesus, who's going to save her. Beautiful story, but I don't think that's what John is doing at all. I think, first off, her coming to the well by day is a literary device that is intended to so John is already telling you where Nicodemus comes by night and lives in darkness because he can't understand. This woman is going to come by day because she's going to get who the Messiah is. And the other thing about the husbands, and you've had 5, and the one we think that this is Jesus trying to have her confront her sin, But that's, I think, appropriating a 21st century view of relationships and then superimposing them to this woman.
Yeah.
What Jesus is actually doing is he is saying that he sees and recognizes the position that this woman has as an outcast in a society in which women were often exploited and abused.
Yeah, precisely. If you were to film a scene of this, John chapter 3 is dark, and then John chapter 4 the blazing sunlight, and it's a theme that John brings up repeatedly. By the time you hit John chapter 9, the man who was born blind,
Yes.
I do my works during the day, this is done during the night. If you thought you could see, you would see, but you claim to see and it makes you blind. This light and darkness, the rapid cut scene that appears as you find this woman in the bright midday sun. Yeah, he's making a very intentional point. At some point, we're going to have that discussion, but it's a funny thing. We like to preach about prostitutes. We do. I mean, you said a woman of ill repute, but yeah, anyway, there's been far too many sermons that have dwelt far too much on that. It's an unusual trend, but like this woman, like you are correct. Like we try and make her out in such a way that I think John is, he is demonstrating that she has been unwanted by many, and she finds herself particularly alone.
Yeah, and yet I think our love to preach about prostitutes has, I think, deep connotations for how we approach women in the spaces of theology. There is, I think, in John, and back to this idea of democratizing education, there is no one in John that engages Jesus at the theological depth that this woman does. She's she's brilliant. She'll come to him and she'll say, Jesus will say, give me a drink of water. And she says, how is it possible that you, a Jew, would speak to a Samaritan like me? She's immediately aware, as only somebody that has been left alone, as you're saying, and abused, she's immediately aware of the invisible but very palpable boundaries that exist with these societal constructs that are built by people in power. And she's asking a question: could it be possible that these boundaries are becoming more porous?
Yeah, it's brilliant. It's brilliant. You can tell, as you said, she is sensitive to them because those boundaries have real consequence for her life. Real consequences. And she, as a protective measure, she must check these things. Like she cannot risk her safety with making a misstep because it was not safe for her. But then there is this moment where, precisely as you've said, like, is this an invitation to a different way of being? And you're correct, Wells. Like, she's incredibly sharp. She's astute and courageous in her questions, and it takes a certain amount of courage, one, to ask that question, but then to have the hope of something new that would better represent her interests and her well-being.
Because change is often driven by people who dare to dream of a different way, and it's a different way because they have to dream of a different way because the current way isn't working for them. So she'll ask, and he says, if you only knew who is asking this of you, you would ask him to give you living water that you would never thirst again. To which she asks the very question that Nicodemus can't seem to ask. Nicodemus says, how is this possible? Do I need to climb back into my mother's womb? She's going to respond, are you greater? Immediately, it's not where is it, how is it? She says, are you greater than our forefather Jacob, who dug this well. So it's an understanding already, just by Jesus inviting her to the conversation, that Jesus is someone else. There's something different about this man. Where Nicodemus sees a rabbi, she sees the possibility, as you're saying, for a new life.
And again, the cutscene, like a highly educated religious figure, and Jesus is giving an apt spiritual metaphor of this process of being born again, which is meaningful language, and which relates to the human condition, and which, like, as an idea, if he had have thought more about it, he could have been curious and asked questions of it. And yet you see this incredible defensiveness in him, where he begins this counter attack and makes the argument absurd. Like, well, can you enter your mother's womb a second time? He gives us physics lessons about how this simply won't work. Right. He does this whataboutism over here and returns to his field of knowledge and tries to shift the argument to the position where he can, say something. And he's like, well, listen, I know pregnancy.
Yeah.
And you're like, but yes, again, contrasted to this woman here, you have somebody who is clearly following the spiritual importance of this conversation and isn't missing.
Yeah. So she asks the question, I think, again, that Nicodemus fails to ask, and it's a question of worship. So she understands that this man is somebody that can speak authoritatively about worship.
Again, the sermons that I've heard, and yes, the amount of prostitutes in sermons that I've heard. And you're right, it does. There's a whole conversation there about gender and women, our conceptions of sin and what the worst sins are and all that sort of stuff.
Right.
But then also, the other sermons that I've heard on this passage are, she takes a spiritual weave, she dodges off in this direction but no, I don't think she's taking a misstep in this conversation. I think she is in that moment making very, very quick deductions. And because of her openness, because of her innovation, because of Jesus expanding the gospel in its definition, you find this preconceived, well-educated individual being contrasted against her who follows the conversation correctly and comes to incredible conclusions. Yeah.
Because she's asking a deeper question, right?
Yeah.
So this is, I think, where the sermons that you're talking about have missed the point. Because we haven't approached these two characters as contrasting. So they miss the point and they say, well, what a dumb question to ask. This is actually a really profound question to ask, because she is engaging Jesus at a deeper level. She realizes really early on, we're not talking about water anymore. We're talking about something else. Now, I don't know what that is, but I know that it's not. I know that you're not talking to me about literal water anymore. So if you're not talking to me about literal water, let's follow the conversation to its most apt conclusion, and that is, let's talk about something deeper. Is it Jerusalem or is it Gerizim?
Absolutely. In such a divided society as back then, your questions about religions are deeply important. Religion functions as an organizing principle over a society. That's what it's meant to do. And a good religious system should organize a society well in terms of all the facets of it. And when you find competing religious systems can create incredible conflict. And so she finds herself in this position where she is trying to resolve the questions of these religious systems, which have incredible direction over the people's lives in that area, and have also resulted in such incredible conflict that at the very beginning of the conversation, she's like, can we even talk to each other? And so she's immediately looking for direction on a deeply important issue.
Yeah. And you know what I think is so powerful that most in the development of a religious system like you're sharing, one of the first things that we do is we seek to make that system concrete. And the way in which we do that is we create this notion of sacred space. And so spaces become, if you think about how a religious system or basically any religious system develops, the first thing is you have this deity, and then you seek to make that concrete. And the way you do that is you localize the deity in a place. So Judaism is forced to make the leap because they don't have a temple anymore by the time John is writing. And so they're forced to make the leap. But the woman is asking a question. This Samaritan woman is asking a question that we often ask. And Jesus moves the conversation still. Okay, she says, where is it? A sacred space. And then he says it's not really about the space or the place. It's about the orientation. And that shift, if you look at kind of how religious systems developed, that shift is a very long and hard one. And often it is only made possible because of some cataclysmic event.
Yes. Yep.
And yet the woman, in a second, this is where I think John is brilliant in making the contrast. As you're saying, it's going to take Nicodemus a long arc that you follow throughout the gospel. She gets it at that moment. She says, oh, so it's not really about the religious space or the sacred place. It's about the orientation that one has to worship.
And if we could properly grasp that idea, the religious violence and conflict that occurs, we could do far better if we could truly follow the importance of that.
She gets it. Spirit and he says, there will come a place where it doesn't matter. What matters is that you come to worship God in spirit and in truth. And then she says, she says, that is a hard thing to grasp. But when Messiah comes, I know we'll understand.
And what it does as well is it allows God, spirit, truth, belief to expand and to be far more accessible to all. Temples are expensive. Like,
yes,
to build a temple, to conquer the land, to create the resources, and then to have access to that temple, it's a very expensive religious system. It's a very costly religious system. And then not only do you have to, conquer land, maintain your temple, then you have to defend, the agrarian land around it. You have to create a structure to, protect the center of your society. And, there's a very complex, expensive, even violent system around defending and creating temple spaces. And you see that all throughout that, the ancient Near East there, as these various nations conquered temples and created temples and protected temples. But then to have this contrasting vision of a religious system where, eventually Paul says that, your body is the temple. That's a shocking religious change that is so essential for the Messiah and for Christianity and for God to be worshipped as such in a new way, a far more peaceful and a far more accessible way.
It's about democratizing access to that which is divine. And I think James Fowler, who talks a lot about kind of stages in faith development, says that is the most difficult. It's the most difficult leap to make because it's just think about it. If you're watching and following us at home, the most difficult leap to make is to take a way of thinking that is very concrete and to now make it abstract. People have if you think about your kids or the educational system, people have a very hard time making that leap. This is what Jesus is doing. He is actually inviting this woman to make that leap in which the presence of God can be made palpable in a place. And now he's saying, well, what if access to God is not as expensive, not as violent, and not as divisive. What if you could access him right now? What would that do to you who are thirsting for water?
Sorry. Yeah.
Go. No,
and that's where he makes that, like, the one who you am speaking to now, that this is me. I am the one who is that. I am the resolution of, as you've said, these temple systems that existed throughout, like
right.
the Old Testament system of the temple. Like, we've dug up multiple temples from multiple religious systems around that area and around the world, and you have these temples that have very strict rules about who's in, who's out, who's accessible, who comes at what price to God, who is able to participate in God. And then you have this moment where you have this woman at the well in the middle of the day. Spirit and truth, I am he. It's a shockingly different version of religion.
Oof. And John says, and she left her jar there.
Yeah. Yep.
What a brilliant little tagline that is, because if you're paying attention to the way John is writing, you've realized that where Nicodemus has failed to be born of water and the Spirit, this woman isn't thirsty anymore because she's got the water of life flowing inside her already.
And then she runs back to the village and come meet. I have found somebody who has told me everything I have done. And it's a brazen line for somebody who has no more shame anymore. Like, it's a confident line for somebody because villages are small.
Yes.
I have 5 husbands in one village. I mean, but she has no more shame. She has no more apology. Come meet the one who knows everything about me. And yet there is this invitation to the one who is accepting of her in spirit and truth,
right.
and has dropped these boundaries, has dropped these rules of participation.
Come see him.
Yeah.
And that, I think, that is... So I don't think we understand. We look at this woman, and like we said before, because it's comfortable. And let's face it, the majority of conversations that are had around faith or any other issue have often been led by men. And we've often had the inability, because we started talking about those in power, because the men, our gender, has been typically the ones who have benefited from these systems and these structures. It's very easy to relegate women to these roles that we see. And so when we read the story, we say, oh, well, this is just terrible. This is the town floozy. 5 husbands in a small village, like you're mentioning, in a culture that doesn't allow for women to engage in polygamy. Men, it's okay, but women can't.
Trade your wives. Yep.
And in a culture which doesn't allow women to possess land or property or any means of sustenance, and in a culture that doesn't really allow women to make decisions not only over their bodies, but over their companions, their partners, their spouses. This means that this woman has been traded from one household to another household to another household to another household, and now she is living and inhabiting kind of in this limbo space. The ancient Near East and Greek culture had this, talking about spaces a little bit, had this very clear distinction between private space and public space. And a woman could not engage in public space if she didn't have the protection of either her father or her husband. Now, a woman could engage people in the private space. So her home, when she was in her home, she could have conversations with men and she could engage them, and because that was private space. it strikes me that when this woman is inviting Jesus, she has, by the way, no private space because she has no husband.
And that, sorry, you're about to finish the idea, but just the shocking absence of Jesus saying, go back and marry your husband first. The shocking silence of Jesus on that you're living with a man who's not your husband. He says nothing about that.
Say it.
He does not. But then keep going. No, yeah.
Because she doesn't need to anymore.
Yeah.
The only reason why you would have to marry a husband, as we said, is so that you would have some sort of volition, a voice in the private space. And now Jesus is sending her back into a very public space, and she speaks. And not only does she speak, but she says, come see. And in that moment, if you understand the culture, your heart both breaks and rejoices at the same time, because what Jesus is saying is, I am your husband. So this protector that gives you a voice within the cultural structure, that's me now. And by her saying, come and see this man, he has told me everything I've ever done, she's in essence inviting people now to her home. Come in now. That's the only place where she. And so in Jesus, these very private spaces become public, and these very public spaces become private. So you have kind of, not only is it the democratization of religion, it's society itself now. These norms, these societal norms are disappearing. Because Jesus is home, Jesus is spouse, Jesus is water, Jesus is new birth. And so all these boundaries, these very clear boundaries that you have before, are no longer needed or useful in this new reality that is Jesus.
Yeah. The sad thing is it's taken us so long to realize this about the scriptures. You look at the book of John, consistently he has women as heroes. Like the hero of the book of John at the end is Mary looking into the tomb and seeing the resurrected Christ, first as she steps out. Like she is the hero contrasted against the disciples,
right,
who are not allowed to see this, And so in this moment, you again, you have this woman here who is by John portrayed clearly as a hero, as you mentioned earlier, It's heartbreaking that we took so long to, one, realize these things, but also to encourage in the democratization of knowledge and education the women's voices as they read these texts. It has been thousands of years. We had this text thousands of years ago. We had this story thousands of years ago, and it's taken us a couple of thousand years to hear this and to listen to this and to see it and to see clearly what was being given to us there. It's just been a shocking waste. Just a shocking waste where we've had just thousands of years of the absolute absence of women's voices in theology and education. Just so much wasted time in history, where if everyone was participating more fully with the vision that Christ has for everyone participating in education and knowledge and the gospel, we could be so much further ahead.
So as I was reading this, I'm going to say something, and it might get us in trouble.
It'll get us views.
So it might get us views. It might also get us in trouble. It might get us kicked out from our new set. It was great while it lasted.
1 week on the couches.
So, I hear a lot in our faith tradition. I speak about the faith tradition that I know. I'm sure other faith traditions have their own problems with who gets a voice at the table. But I speak of what I know. So I hear about our faith tradition, and our faith tradition says that we are waiting. We're waiting because we need the bread of life. So we're waiting for him to return. He's coming back. He's coming back. And yet, the whole process, to use your analogy of the USSR, the whole process of baking that bread is still controlled by very few people. And I don't understand that. Like, I wonder, you were saying this, that we've had this text for 2,000 years. I wonder if we'd still be waiting if we had been more democratic on the voices that got invited to speak about what the gospel is. I wonder if we wouldn't all be eating manna in heaven had we been more open to allowing voices. And that's the heartbreaking piece to me, that our faith tradition, as we know, so invested in talking about the return of the Messiah, the one who gives us water, has that as its stated goal, but also in some places of the world is very restrictive on who controls and who speaks and who does and who says.
The more people who participate in that, the better it will be. We have been listening to the cries from Revelation, how long, O Lord, how long, O Lord, will we persist in this suffering? And if we invite everyone to participate in this system, our ability to alleviate suffering, our ability to truly be the gospel in this world will be far, far improved.
Well, friends, we don't know if we'll see you next week after that, but as I said, Chris, it's so good to just chat with you. Again, you are a man that enjoys working out. You are a man that enjoys surfing, good food, but above all, you are a man that enjoys thinking deeply about faith and about I think the role that faith plays in a world that, as you said, is suffering. And so thank you for your thoughtfulness as always.
A pleasure to be led through this conversation with you as well. Just brilliant.
It's always a blast. So pray for us as we finish.
To the one in whom we live and move and have our being, to the one above all, the Spirit and truth, God, we come to you and we seek just the ways in which we can live in this world the ways in which we can live in this world, which will bless us and bless others. Guide us in these things. Amen.
Amen. So, friend, invite people to the process. The more people are involved, the better it will be. We'll see you next week.